The blood-curdling screech of the Vornax reverberated through the dense jungle as Frank Turner stumbled over another root, nearly falling face first into the fluorescent moss. The alien predator was gaining ground, its 6 powerful legs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. Frank's lungs burned as if filled with acid, but he couldn't afford to slow down, not with the beast's razor-sharp mandibles just meters behind him. "Move your pathetic legs, human," shouted Zrek, the Quilarian cadet who had reluctantly been paired with Frank for this survival exercise. "The Vornax can smell your fear." Frank gritted his teeth and pushed harder, remembering the mocking laughter that had echoed through the academy halls just yesterday. The memory fueled his burning muscles as he leaped over a fallen log with surprising agility. 24 hours ago, he had been nothing but a joke to them. Now, he was fighting to prove them all wrong and to stay alive. Frank had been the first human accepted into the Galactic Defense Academy on Quilar Prime, a prestigious institution that trained the best warriors from across 17 star systems. The Intergalactic Alliance had been skeptical about allowing humans to join, considering Earth had only achieved faster-than-light travel 15 years ago. Humans were still seen as the galaxy's newcomers, clumsy, fragile, and inexperienced. When Frank arrived at the Academy 3 weeks ago, the alien cadets hadn't bothered to hide their disdain. The Quilarians with their 4 arms and enhanced strength, the Volarians with their natural telepathic abilities, and the Kriziks with their exoskeletons that could withstand extreme pressure, all of them viewed Frank as nothing more than a liability. His first day of physical training had been a disaster. The Quilarian gravity was 1.3 times that of Earth, making every movement more difficult. While the alien cadets navigated the obstacle course with grace and precision, Frank had stumbled, tripped, and fallen repeatedly. "Look at those legs," Tarkus, the top Quilarian cadet, had sneered. "They're like weak sticks. How do humans even support themselves with just 2? Frank had tried to ignore the comments, focusing instead on completing the course. But when he'd fallen for the 5th time while attempting to scale a simple climbing wall, the entire training area had erupted in laughter. "Perhaps we should send him back to Earth," said Velora, a Krizik female whose iridescent exoskeleton gleamed in the light of Quilar's twin suns. "Humans clearly aren't built for real combat." Commander Drax, the gruff Volarian in charge of the first-year cadets, had silenced them with a sharp look. "Enough. Turner may not have your physical advantages, but the Alliance accepted him for a reason. He'll adapt or he'll fail just like any of you." But the damage had been done. As Frank limped back to his quarters that evening, his legs aching from the unaccustomed gravity, he could hear the whispers and snickers following him down the corridor. His roommate, Zrek, had been slightly more sympathetic than the others. At least, he hadn't openly mocked Frank to his face. "You humans evolved on a planet with minimal predators and low gravity," Zrek had explained while organizing his belongings. "It's not your fault your species developed such inefficient bodies." "Thanks," Frank had replied dryly. "That makes me feel much better." Zrek had shrugged his 4 shoulders. "I'm just stating facts. Tomorrow's survival exercise will be challenging for you. We'll be dropped in the Crimson Jungle for 24 hours. It's one of the most dangerous ecosystems on Quilar Prime." Frank had groaned internally. "What kind of dangers are we talking about?" "The usual. Poisonous plants, carnivorous fungi, and of course the Vornax." "The what?" "Vornax. 6-legged predators that can outrun any species in the galaxy. They're territorial and aggressive. Don't worry, though they usually go for the slowest prey." Frank had glared at him. "So me." Zrek's face had broken into what passed for a Quilarian smile. "Consider it motivation to improve your speed." The next morning, Commander Drax had gathered all 30 first-year cadets at the transport bay. Each was paired with another cadet and given basic survival gear: a water purifier, a small medical kit, and a communications device for emergencies only. This exercise is designed to test your survival skills and your ability to work together, Drax had explained. Your objective is simple. Reach the extraction point by tomorrow at sunset. The jungle will test your limits, but remember this is not a competition between pairs. Help each other if needed. Frank had noticed several cadets exchanging glances when Drax mentioned helping others. It was clear that many viewed this as precisely the competition Drax claimed it wasn't. One final note, Drax had continued. The comms devices are for genuine emergencies only. Using them for any other reason will result in immediate failure of the exercise. The transport had deposited Frank and Zirek in a clearing surrounded by towering trees with crimson leaves that gave the jungle its name. The air was thick with humidity and strange, sweet scents that made Frank's head spin slightly. We should head east, Zirek had said immediately. The extraction point is approximately 20 kilometers in that direction. Frank had checked his wrist device, which displayed a simple map. Looks like there's a river we'll need to cross about halfway there. That's the least of our concerns, Zirek had replied. Let's move. The sooner we start, the better chance we have of reaching the extraction point before nightfall tomorrow. They had made decent progress for the first few hours. Frank had focused intently on each step, determined not to trip or stumble as he had during training. The extra gravity still made his movements awkward, but he was slowly adapting. Then Zirek had stopped suddenly, raising one hand in warning. Do you hear that? Frank had strained his ears but detected nothing unusual, just the constant background noise of the jungle. No, what is it? The birds have stopped singing, Zirek had whispered. Something's hunting nearby. Before Frank could respond, they'd heard a high-pitched screech that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Vornax, Zirek had hissed, his eyes widening. We need to hide. Now, they ducked behind a massive tree trunk just as a creature burst into the clearing. It stood about a meter tall at the shoulder, with 6 powerful legs ending in sharp claws. Its elongated head featured multiple eyes and a mouth full of needle-like teeth. The predator's skin was a mottled pattern of red and brown that blended perfectly with the jungle floor. Don't move, Zirek had breathed. They hunt primarily by movement and scent. They'd remained frozen as the Vornax sniffed the air, its head swiveling in their direction. Frank's heart had pounded so loudly he was certain the creature could hear it. After what seemed like an eternity, the predator had turned away, apparently losing interest, and disappeared back into the undergrowth. That was close, Frank had whispered once he was sure the Vornax was gone. Zirek had nodded. Too close. We need to be more careful. They'd continued their journey, moving more cautiously now. Frank had paid even closer attention to his footing, determined not to make unnecessary noise. Despite his best efforts, he still occasionally stumbled on the uneven terrain, each time earning an impatient look from Zirek. By late afternoon, they'd reached the river Zirek had mentioned. It was wider than Frank had expected, with a strong current that would make crossing difficult. There should be a fallen tree or something we can use to cross, Frank had said, scanning the riverbank. Zirek had pointed upstream. There, about 100 meters up. They'd found a massive tree that had fallen across the river, creating a natural bridge. The trunk was wide enough to walk on, but the bark was slick with moisture and moss. I'll go first, Zirek had offered. Watch how I place my feet. The Quilarian had crossed with surprising grace, using his 4 arms for balance. When he reached the other side, he'd turned to watch Frank. Your turn, human. Try not to fall in the water. Contains parasites that can burrow under your skin. Thanks for that helpful information, Frank had muttered as he'd carefully stepped onto the log. He'd moved slowly, arms outstretched for balance. The bark was even more slippery than it looked, and about halfway across his foot had slid. Frank had managed to catch himself before falling completely, but he'd ended up straddling the log in an awkward position, earning a laugh from Zirek. Very graceful, the Quilarian had called. Perhaps in your next life you'll evolve with more than 2 legs. Gritting his teeth, Frank had pulled himself up and continued across, finally reaching the other side with his dignity only slightly bruised. "We should find a place to make camp soon," Zarek had said, checking the position of the suns, which were beginning to sink toward the horizon. The jungle becomes much more dangerous after dark. They'd found a small clearing protected on 3 sides by dense vegetation. Zarek had used his superior strength to gather branches for a shelter, while Frank collected materials for a fire. As night fell, they'd sat beside the small fire, eating the nutrient bars provided in their survival packs. The jungle had come alive with sounds, strange calls, rustling movements, and occasional distant screeches that Frank tried not to think about too much. "How are your legs holding up?" Zarek had asked suddenly. Frank had been surprised by the question. "Sore, but I'll manage. Why?" "Just calculating our chances of reaching the extraction point tomorrow. The terrain will get rougher from here and we'll need to maintain a good pace." "I won't slow you down," Frank had promised, perhaps with more confidence than he'd felt. Zarek had made a non-committal sound. "We'll see. Get some rest. I'll take first watch." Frank had lain down on the makeshift bed of leaves, his muscles aching from the day's exertion. Despite his exhaustion, sleep had been elusive as unfamiliar night sounds kept him on edge. When Zarek had finally woken him for his watch, Frank had felt as though he'd barely slept at all. The Quilarian had immediately curled up and fallen asleep, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts and the unsettling noises of the jungle night. Morning had arrived with a dense mist that limited visibility to just a few meters. They'd packed up their makeshift camp and continued east, moving more slowly due to the poor visibility. "We need to pick up the pace," Zarek had said after checking his map. "We've still got at least 12 kilometers to go and the extraction transport won't wait." "I'm moving as fast as I can," Frank had replied, trying to hide his frustration. "That's the problem." Zarek's tone had been matter-of-fact rather than malicious. "You're as fast as I can isn't fast enough." Frank had been about to respond when a movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. He'd stopped, turning his head slowly to look. Through the mist, he'd seen multiple sets of eyes glowing an eerie yellow-green. Then he'd heard the now familiar screech of a Vornax. "Run!" Zarek had shouted, already taking off through the undergrowth. Frank had sprinted after him, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind them, he could hear the Vornax crashing through the vegetation, gaining ground with every second. "It's gaining on us," Frank had yelled. "Split up." Zarek had called back. "It can only chase one of us." Before Frank could protest, the Quilarian had veered sharply to the right and disappeared into the dense foliage. Frank had continued straight ahead, his lungs burning as he pushed his body to its limit. The sound of the pursuing predator had grown louder, confirming his fear the Vornax had chosen to follow him, the slower target. A fallen tree had appeared in his path. Frank had tried to leap over it but misjudged the height in the higher gravity. His foot had caught on the trunk, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain had shot through his ankle as he'd scrambled to his feet. Sprained, not broken, he'd hoped, but there was no time to check. The Vornax's screech had sounded again, much closer now. That was how Frank had found himself in his current situation, running for his life through an alien jungle with an injured ankle and a relentless predator on his tail. "Move your pathetic legs, human," Zarek shouted again from somewhere ahead. Frank couldn't see his partner, but he could hear him crashing through the undergrowth. Apparently, the Quilarian had circled back when he realized the Vornax was pursuing Frank. The pain in Frank's ankle flared with each step, but adrenaline kept him moving. He could hear the Vornax gaining ground its 6 legs, giving it a significant advantage on the uneven terrain. "There's a ravine ahead," Zarek called. "If we can reach it, we might lose the Vornax." Frank pushed harder, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ankle. The Vornax was so close now that he could hear its heavy breathing. Suddenly, the ground dropped away before him. The ravine Zarek had mentioned was more of a cliff with a steep, muddy slope leading down to a narrow stream about 15 meters below. Without hesitation, Frank threw himself forward, sliding down the muddy incline on his back. Behind him, the Vornax skidded to a stop at the edge, unwilling to follow. Frank's descent was anything but controlled. He bounced off rocks and roots, mud coating his uniform as he picked up speed. When he finally reached the bottom, he slammed into a fallen log, knocking the wind from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there gasping, convinced he'd broken several ribs. Then he heard Zrex sliding down the slope with considerably more control, using his forearms to slow his descent. "Are you alive?" the Quilarian asked as he reached the bottom. Frank managed to sit up, wincing at the pain in his side. "More or less, the Vornax, still up there. They don't like steep descents. Center of gravity is too high." Frank nodded, then inspected his ankle. It was swollen and turning purple, but he could still move it. "I think it's just a bad sprain." Zrex examined the injury with a critical eye. "You won't be able to continue at any reasonable pace with that." "I'll manage," Frank insisted, using the log to pull himself to his feet. He tested his weight on the injured ankle and immediately regretted it as pain shot up his leg. Zrex watched him with what might have been concern or simply calculation. "We still have 10 kilometers to go, and the extraction transport leaves at sunset." "Then we'd better get moving," Frank said through gritted teeth. They followed the stream for several hundred meters before finding a less steep slope they could climb to return to their eastward route. Every step was agony for Frank, but he refused to complain or ask for help. By midday, the pain had become almost unbearable. Frank's pace had slowed considerably, and Zrex's impatience was increasingly evident. "At this rate, we won't reach the extraction point until tomorrow," the Quilarian said as they stopped for a brief rest. Frank took a sip from his water container. "What do you suggest?" "That I use the emergency calm and fail the exercise." Zrex's 4 hands clenched and unclenched, a sign of frustration Frank had learned to recognize. "No, but we need a solution." Frank examined his ankle again. The swelling had worsened, and the bruising now extended halfway up his calf. He rummaged through his small medical kit and found a compression bandage. "This might help," he said, wrapping the bandage tightly around his ankle. "And I can fashion a walking stick." Zrex watched as Frank broke a straight branch to the right length and tested it. The makeshift crutch helped take some weight off his injured ankle. "Better," Frank said, taking a few experimental steps. "Let's go." They continued their journey, moving at a slightly improved pace. The jungle grew denser as they progressed, forcing them to navigate through thick undergrowth and around massive tree trunks. Frank's determination impressed even Zrex, who occasionally glanced back with what might have been respect in his alien eyes. The human's face was pale with pain, but he kept moving without complaint. As the afternoon wore on, they heard distant screeches that made them both tense. "More Vornax," Zrex said quietly. "A different one from this morning. They're territorial." Frank nodded, tightening his grip on his walking stick. "How much further to the extraction point?" "About 4 kilometers. We'll make it barely." They pushed on, the sounds of the jungle growing more ominous as the twin suns began their descent toward the horizon. Frank's injured ankle had gone from painful to nearly numb, which he knew wasn't a good sign but was grateful for the temporary relief. They were making better time now, and Frank allowed himself to believe they might actually complete the exercise successfully. Then they heard it, the unmistakable screech of a Vornax, much closer than the earlier calls. "Not again," Frank muttered. Zrex's head swiveled in the direction of the sound. "It's hunting something else. If we stay quiet, it might not notice us." They continued forward more cautiously, trying to move as silently as possible. Frank winced each time his walking stick cracked against a stone or root. They'd almost convinced themselves they were safe when a thunderous crash erupted from the vegetation to their right. A Vornax burst into view, even larger than the one they'd encountered that morning. Its eyes locked onto them immediately. "Run!" Zrex shouted, already taking off. Frank tried to follow, but his injured ankle gave way almost immediately. He fell hard, his walking stick snapping beneath him. Pushing himself up, he knew he couldn't outrun the predator, not in his condition. "Go," he yelled to Zerek, who had paused to look back. "Get to the extraction point." The Quilarian hesitated, clearly torn between self-preservation and helping his partner. The Vornax charged, its powerful legs eating up the distance between it and Frank in seconds. In that moment, Frank made a split-second decision that surprised even himself. Instead of trying to run, he lunged directly at the predator. The unexpected move caught the Vornax off guard. It skidded slightly, giving Frank just enough time to dodge to one side and grab a fallen branch. As the creature recovered and lunged again, Frank swung the branch with all his strength, connecting with the side of its head. The impact jarred every bone in Frank's arms, but it knocked the Vornax off balance. The creature shook its head, clearly dazed but far from defeated. "What are you doing?" Zerek shouted from nearby. "Buying us time?" Frank called back, keeping his eyes on the predator. "There must be something we can use against it." The Vornax circled Frank warily now, reassessing this prey that fought back. Frank matched its movements, ignoring the screaming pain in his ankle as he pivoted to keep facing the creature. "The river," Zerek suddenly exclaimed. "There's a river just ahead. Vornax can't swim." Frank began backing slowly in the direction Zerek indicated, keeping the branch between himself and the predator. The Vornax followed, its multiple eyes never leaving Frank's movements. "How far?" Frank asked through clenched teeth. 200 meters, maybe less," Zerek replied, moving to flank the Vornax. The creature's head swiveled between the two cadets, trying to track both potential prey. Frank used the distraction to back up more quickly, wincing as each step sent fresh pain shooting up his leg. The Vornax suddenly seemed to make a decision. It turned fully toward Frank and charged. Frank turned and ran, or rather, hobbled as fast as his injured ankle would allow. Behind him, he could hear the Vornax gaining ground with frightening speed. Zerek appeared beside him, forearms reaching out. "Jump on my back." Without questioning the offer, Frank leaped awkwardly onto the Quilarian's back. Zerek's superior strength allowed him to carry Frank with relative ease, and his four legs moved with impressive speed through the undergrowth. "I can hear the river," Frank called as the sound of rushing water reached them. The Vornax was still in pursuit, its screeches growing more frenzied as its prey continued to elude it. Zerek pushed harder, his breathing becoming labored under the combined strain of Frank's weight and the extended sprint. They burst through a line of trees, and suddenly the river was before them, wider and faster flowing than the one they'd crossed the previous day. "Can you swim?" Zerek asked as he skidded to a halt at the bank. "Yes," Frank replied, sliding off the Quilarian's back. "But what about the parasites you mentioned?" "Better than being eaten," Zerek said as the sound of the pursuing Vornax grew louder. Without further discussion, they plunged into the cold water. The current immediately caught them, pulling them downstream. Frank struggled to keep his head above water, his injured ankle making it difficult to swim effectively. Behind them, the Vornax reached the riverbank and paced back and forth, screeching in frustration as its prey escaped. Frank and Zerek allowed the current to carry them several hundred meters downstream before fighting their way to the opposite bank. They dragged themselves onto the shore, both gasping for breath. That was. Frank paused to cough up river water. Too close. Zerek nodded, water dripping from his forearms. "Yes, but effective." He checked his wrist device, which was fortunately waterproof. "We still have about 3 kilometers to the extraction point and 2 hours until sunset." Frank looked down at his ankle, which had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The compression bandage had come off in the river, and the cold water had temporarily numbed the pain, but he knew it wouldn't last. "I can make it," he said with more confidence than he felt. Zerek studied him for a moment. "I believe you can." There was no mockery in his voice this time. They set off again, moving at a steady pace. Frank fashioned another walking stick, which helped, but every step was still an exercise in endurance. The twin suns were sinking rapidly now, casting long shadows through the crimson leaves. Less than a kilometer to go. Zirek announced after they'd been walking for nearly an hour. We'll make it in time. Frank nodded, too focused on managing his pain to respond verbally. His uniform was still soaked from the river, adding to his discomfort, but the thought of completing the exercise successfully kept him moving forward. They began to hear voices ahead, other cadets who had already reached the extraction point. The sounds energized Frank, giving him a final burst of determination. As they emerged from the jungle into a large clearing, Frank saw the transport vessel waiting with its ramp extended. Several groups of cadets were already there, looking various degrees of exhausted and disheveled. Commander Drax stood at the base of the ramp, checking off pairs as they arrived. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Frank limping beside Zirek. Turner, Zirek, he acknowledged. Cutting it close. Status? Mission accomplished, sir, Zirek reported. Though Cadet Turner requires medical attention for an ankle injury, Drax nodded. Get aboard. Medical bay is prepped for injuries. As they moved toward the ramp, Frank noticed the other cadets watching them, particularly him. Their expressions ranged from surprise to something that might have been respect. Tarkus, the Quilarian who had mocked Frank most openly during training, approached them. You actually made it, human, with an injury, no less. Frank met his gaze steadily. Looks that way. He also faced down a Vornax, Zirek added unexpectedly. Bought us time to reach the river. Tarkus's 4 eyes blinked in surprise. A Vornax, and you're still alive? Other cadets had gathered around now, listening to the exchange with interest. Not only that, Zirek continued, but when we were pursued by a different Vornax this morning, the human kept pace despite his injury. Not many species can claim to have outrun a Vornax even temporarily. Frank was surprised by Zirek's words. It wasn't quite accurate, he hadn't exactly outrun the predator, but he appreciated the support nonetheless. Is this true, Cadet Turner? Commander Drax asked, his voice neutral but his eyes showing interest. Frank hesitated. Sir, I wouldn't say I outran it. We escaped by using the terrain to our advantage. Don't be modest, human, Zirek said. Your injured ankle slowed you down. At full capacity, you might have given the Vornax a real chase. The gathered cadets murmured among themselves, reassessing the human in their midst. Velora, the Krizik female who had suggested sending Frank back to Earth, stepped forward. Perhaps there is more to human physiology than we first assumed, she said, her mandibles clicking thoughtfully. Your endurance is impressive. Frank managed a smile despite his pain. Thanks. Though right now, all I want to do is sit down. This earned a laugh from several cadets, breaking the tension. All right, everyone aboard, Commander Drax ordered. We'll conduct a full debrief back at the academy. As Frank limped up the ramp, leaning heavily on his walking stick, Zirek fell into step beside him. Why did you do that? Frank asked quietly. Make it sound like I outran the Vornax. Zirek's alien features formed what Frank had come to recognize as a smile. Because you earned their respect today. Not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by refusing to give up despite your limitations. That's something even we four-armed, four-legged Quilarians can appreciate. In the medical bay, a Volarian doctor examined Frank's ankle with professional efficiency. Grade 2 sprain, she diagnosed. Torn ligaments, but nothing that won't heal with proper treatment. You're lucky it's not worse, considering what you put it through. She applied a healing gel that immediately reduced the pain, then wrapped the ankle in a proper support bandage. Stay off it for at least 3 days. After that, limited weight bearing for another week, Frank nodded. Thank you, doctor. When she moved away to treat another cadet, Zirek approached Frank's bed. The commander wants all cadets in the debriefing room once we land, but he said you can report to him tomorrow instead. I'll go today, Frank said, carefully swinging his legs off the bed. I started this exercise with everyone else. I'll finish it the same way. Zirek handed him a set of crutches the doctor had left nearby. I thought you might say that. Back at the academy, the debriefing was held in a large lecture hall. Frank sat at the end of a row, his injured leg elevated on an empty chair as Commander Drax addressed the assembled cadets. The survival exercise is designed to test more than just your physical abilities, the commander explained. It tests your judgment, your adaptability, and your willingness to work together. Some of you excelled in these areas while others. He paused, his gaze sweeping over certain cadets who shifted uncomfortably. Others have room for improvement. He proceeded to highlight specific incidents from various teams' experiences, offering praise or criticism as warranted. When he came to Frank and Zirek, he paused. Cadet Turner and Cadet Zirek faced multiple challenges during their journey, including 2 separate encounters with Vornax predators. Despite an injury that would have led many to activate their emergency beacon, Cadet Turner persevered. The commander's eyes fixed on Frank. While humans may not possess the natural advantages of many species represented at this academy, today demonstrated that determination and adaptability can be equally valuable traits. Let this be a lesson to all of you: never underestimate any opponent, ally, or comrade based solely on their species. After the debriefing, several cadets approached Frank to ask about his encounter with the Vornax. The same students who had laughed at his clumsiness days earlier now listened with interest as he described the experience. "So you actually charged at it?" Tarkus asked, his disbelief evident. Frank shrugged. "It was going to catch me anyway. I figured surprising it was my only option." "Unconventional but effective," Velora commented. "Perhaps this is why the Alliance was interested in including humans in the Academy. You think differently." Later that evening, as Frank sat in the Academy's dining hall with his injured ankle propped up, Commander Drax approached his table. "How's the ankle, Cadet?" "Better, sir, thank you. The doctor says I should be able to resume light training in about a week." Drax nodded. "Good. I've reviewed the tracking data from your wrist devices. You and Zirek covered ground at an impressive pace, even after your injury." "Zirek deserves most of the credit, sir. He could have left me behind and completed the exercise much faster." "Perhaps," Drax agreed, "but he made the right choice." The Alliance needs officers who understand that sometimes the mission is about more than just reaching the objective. It's about how you get there, and who you bring with you. The commander paused, studying Frank thoughtfully. When the Alliance first suggested accepting a human into the Academy, there was significant resistance. Many felt your species wasn't ready. I was among the skeptics. "And now, sir? Now I think you've earned your place here, Cadet Turner. Not because you're as strong as a Quilarian or as naturally agile as a Krizik, but because you've demonstrated qualities that are valuable in any officer: determination, courage, and adaptability." In the weeks that followed, Frank's status at the Academy underwent a subtle but significant change. The open mockery disappeared, replaced by a wary respect. When he returned to physical training with his healing ankle, he still struggled with certain exercises, but now other cadets offered suggestions rather than ridicule. Zirek proved to be a surprisingly dedicated partner during Frank's recovery, helping him develop modified techniques that played to human strengths rather than alien ones. "Humans evolved as pursuit predators," Zirek explained one day as they trained. "Your ancestors would chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. You're not built for sprinting like a Vornax, but for endurance." Frank absorbed this information, beginning to understand his own physiology from an alien perspective. "So while I might not win a short race, in a longer one, against most species, you'd have the advantage," Zirek confirmed. "Especially in environments closer to Earth's gravity." This insight led Frank to adjust his training approach. Rather than trying to match the alien's natural abilities, he focused on developing his uniquely human strengths. His endurance improved dramatically, and he learned to move more efficiently in Quilar's higher gravity. 6 months later, during the Academy's annual physical assessment, Frank surprised everyone, including himself, by outperforming several alien cadets in the endurance events. His technique for navigating the obstacle course, while different from the aliens, proved equally effective. After completing the climbing wall that had once been his greatest embarrassment, Frank caught Tarkus watching him with newfound respect. "You've improved, human," the Quilarian acknowledged. Frank smiled. "Thanks, though I still wouldn't want to face a Vornax again anytime soon." Tarkus made the clicking sound that passed for Quilarian laughter. "None of us would, but if I had to, I might want you on my team." That evening, as Frank sat with Zirek and several other cadets in the common area, Commander Drax entered and approached their group. "Cadet Turner," he said. "The Alliance Exploration Corps has requested a human participant for their upcoming mission to the Tarvos system. They specifically asked for you." Frank blinked in surprise. "Me, sir. Why?" "The planet they're surveying has similar gravity to Earth, but features terrain that would challenge most Alliance species. They believe your human physiology might be advantageous there." Drax's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of pride in his voice. "It seems your performance during the survival exercise has not gone unnoticed." As the commander walked away, the other cadets congratulated Frank on the opportunity. Zirek clapped him on the shoulder with one of his 4 hands. "From laughingstock to specially requested explorer in 6 months, the Quilarian observed. "Not bad for a clumsy human," Frank grinned. "Just imagine what I could do with 4 legs and 4 arms." "Probably trip over all of them," Zirek replied, but his tone was friendly rather than mocking. Later that night, as Frank prepared for bed, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. He looked different from the uncertain cadet who had arrived at the academy half a year ago, more confident, more capable. The journey hadn't been easy, and he still faced challenges that his alien classmates did not. But he had found his place among them, earning respect not by trying to be like them, but by embracing the unique qualities that made him human. As he drifted off to sleep, Frank reflected that sometimes being underestimated was actually an advantage. The aliens had laughed at his clumsy steps, never expecting him to outrun their fastest predator or to prove that humans belonged among the stars.